In constructing this panel, we wanted to offer you three perspectives. The first perspective is the regulator's perspective, offered by Corey Booth from the Securities and Exchange Commission, as we ask ourselves, to what extent can information technology enable the SEC to become more effective at managing the vast mountains of regulatory data submitted to it on an annual basis by publicly traded corporations within the United States. The second perspective is that of the user, when we ask ourselves, what do companies need to do to become more compliant with the regulations? Can we, for example, identify some semblance of best practices in this space? The user's perspective is uniquely intertwined with the third perspective, which is that of the vendor. In this case, offered by Tom Heiser and EMC Corporation as a vendor of information storage solutions that figure prominently in companies' compliance efforts. Unfortunately, our third panelist, Ron Stroud from State Street, who had planned on presenting the user's perspective, is unable to make it due to illness. But Tom Heiser has some case study information, and so despite the fact that Ron is not going to be able to make it, we will still be able to present some semblance of the issues that the users are facing in this space. Companies are collecting currently data at an annual rate of 400 megabytes for every man, woman, and child on the planet. Now, I'm sure you're probably reaching for your calculators at this point to figure out exactly how does that translate into a big picture. But the answer is it translates into 2 exabytes of data annually, i.e. it's 2 by 10 to the power of 18 if you're keeping score. It's a big number. And of course, that bodes well for corporations such as EMC, who happen to sell hardware among other services in this particular space. But we do have to ask ourselves, if corporations are collecting vast volumes of data, what are some of the issues that they are facing, both from a regulatory and from a management perspective? By considering these three perspectives, that of the regulator, the user, and the vendor, we hope to offer you some interesting insights into how information technology figures in this increasingly important debate. We will begin the panel with a 30-minute presentation from Corey Booth. That will be followed by a 30-minute presentation from Tom Heiser, and immediately after that we'll have a 30-minute Q&A session with both panelists and with the audience. We're also honoured to welcome Steve Boletta from State Street SSGA, who in Ron Stroud's absence we're thankful for this. He's willing to field some questions from the audience that deal specifically with the user's perspective. And so with that, I'd like to hand over to our first presenter, Corey Booth. So please join with me in welcoming our first speaker, Corey Booth.
Thank you very much for coming today, and I'd also like to thank Professor Talon as well as the Tech Club for bringing this panel together. I think these are some interesting issues that, frankly, we're all grappling with. Hopefully between folks like the SEC and folks like EMC, and as well as folks like State Street, the three of us represent something like good answers to some of the issues that are swirling around in the compliance world these days. But I'll look forward to the entire audience here being the judge of whether or not we seem to be on the right track. As you heard a little bit about my bio, I've been with the SEC for about a year now, and I guess you could say that we're just finishing up about the second year of Bill Donaldson's tenure as chairman of the SEC. He came in at a very difficult time, shortly following all the financial scandals that hit Wall Street, as well as certain towns in Texas and a few other places like that really generated a lot of headlines and really, in our opinion, caused a real crisis in investor confidence. Is the playing field actually level? Is the deck stacked against investors in such a way that it really doesn't make sense to participate in the market? What the SEC has been trying to do over the last couple of years is ultimately to restore that confidence and to create an environment whereby disclosure happens in such a way that allows people to really understand what they're investing in, that it makes sure that markets are fair, and makes sure the companies can actually access the capital markets to get the capital they need to grow the business. So what we're really trying to do is bring a combined regulatory as well as a commercial mindset to bear against some of these problems to really make sure that the kinds of things that we're doing are in the interest of creating this kind of fair market structure. So what I thought I'd do today is spend a little bit of time talking, first of all, about what the SEC is really trying to do, and a little bit about what we do for a living there, as a little bit of an introduction, because in fact it does a lot more in some ways than I'd realized when I joined. We can talk a little bit then about what we're trying to do with respect to various aspects of the financial markets in our various program activities. Segueing from that into a little bit of a dive into the role of technology at the SEC, although since I know this is an MBA audience, I'm not going to get too deep into that. And actually I'm an MBA and an English major myself, so I probably couldn't be too deep if I wanted to be. And then finally, a little bit of speculation about the kinds of things that this kind of program that we've put together really might mean down the road for the various participants in the market. So starting with the SEC. The best way to start this is just by talking about what the SEC actually does from the scope of its regulatory authority. First one, which many of you guys may know something about, although you don't know it, is Corporation Finance, which is the group that oversees corporate issuers of securities, debt and equity securities. They oversee all the filings that are made within the EDGAR system, so anyone who's ever downloaded a 10K from the SEC site or elsewhere, that's basically the group that is responsible for reading that document, making sure that it's compliant with all the things that it needs to be compliant with regards to disclosure. They also oversee merger documents, IPO documents, and things like that. So for those of you who may have been paying attention, there was a little bit of a kerfuffle over Google's IPO and over Salesforce.com's IPO, which was really largely about the Division of Corporation Finance trying to make sure that the rules were followed for those kinds of transactions as well. Investment management is the second group, which is really in charge of mutual funds and investment advisors. And now with a recent round of rulemaking earlier last year, hedge funds as well, which are now in, to make a long story short, required to register as investment advisors under certain circumstances. Market regulation is the group that really oversees the functioning of the markets themselves in terms of the exchanges and the broker-dealers. And I'm not necessarily assuming a lot about how much you guys know about the structure of the financial services industry. Broker-dealers basically means people who trade stocks, stock brokerages, investment banks, things like that. As well as some back office types of companies such as clearing companies and transfer agents that basically make sure all the shares trade hands effectively under the hood. Finally, there are some other groups that do things like oversee the accounting standards bodies. We have certain oversight responsibilities over the FASB and over the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, which is actually the primary group responsible for implementing Sarbanes-Oxley. And so there's some of those kinds of responsibilities as well. Now, across all of these areas, it's also helpful to think about basically the steps in our business system. What are the basic things that the SEC does for a living within these areas of regulatory authority? First one, and a relatively new one, frankly, is called risk assessment. We've recently set up an office to do this, and we're really trying to embed it in everything we do. But what do we mean by that? Essentially, what we mean by that is what the chairman would say is we want to look over the hills and around the corners to try to make sure that we are identifying areas of risk in the financial markets before they become big issues, before they become multi-billion-dollar losses, before they become, big cases for us. And therefore we can put in place the kinds of stopgap measures that we need, the kinds of regulations or the kinds of examinations that we would need in order to try to alleviate harm before it really happens. Second one is rulemaking, which is basically our regulatory activity. Rules that say things like, you should back up your corporate records for X number of years. You should make sure that you are certifying your financial statements in accordance with Sarbanes-Oxley, things like that. Disclosure is really about the things that are filed with the SEC and then publicly disclosed. So, those are all the documents you download from EDGAR. There are similar kinds of disclosure requirements for mutual funds and some of the other companies that are affiliated with us. Review and examination is essentially what happens next. That's where we read the stuff. That's where we, actually go out to certain mutual funds and exchanges and broker-dealers and actually make sure that they're following the rules through a small team of people that basically goes through and looks through the materials on site and interviews people on site to try to make sure that the compliance programs in those firms is actually structured well and catching the problems. If that doesn't work, then you have investigation, which is essentially the start of our enforcement process. where we start issuing subpoenas. We start looking for more and more information to try to figure out whether wrongdoing has actually taken place. And then, of course, we get into litigation if we need to. So you know, as we talk, these are some of the business processes that essentially we're trying to deal with within the SEC. There are other regulators in the mix too, which I won't spend a ton of time talking about, but it's perhaps helpful to know that the stock exchanges themselves actually have certain regulatory authorities over the way that they function and over the activities of the broker dealers and the individual stockbrokers that register with those exchanges. Accounting organizations are of course responsible for passing various rulings associated with accounting treatment and disclosure and things like that. And of course we work with other regulators and other agencies at the federal, state, and international level as needed. So if we're going after a company like Parmalat, which basically a lot of U.S. investors lost money, but it was an Italian company, obviously we have to work with the Italians in order to try to figure out what to do about that. So that's a quick overview. Let's talk a little bit about what we're trying to accomplish these days. Obviously, you know, there's a little bit of a rogues gallery of folks that have made the headlines recently. I don't know how many of these are familiar to you folks. Some of them are more household names than others, but these are all things where we've kind of you know, issued public statements one way or another saying that these companies did a bad thing over the past year or so, and I'm sure you can think of lots of names that aren't on that list. So there's all this, and that has energized both us as well as Elliot Spitzer, as well as the business media, as well as various other folks to really take a close look at what's going on in the securities markets and trying to figure out how to kind of keep these kinds of things from happening with the kind of frequency that they've happened over the last 5 years. At the same time, there are a lot of other drivers that are going on in the industry, and these are only a few of them. Retail investor interest in complex products, things like exchange-traded funds, things like fixed income, things like variable annuities. These are all very complex products, and you know, one of the things we want to make sure is that companies know what they're getting into when they buy those things. Exchanges themselves are no longer private clubs and nonprofits. Over in Europe, they are essentially in a for-profit environment today, and there's evidence that the U.S. market may be going in that direction as well, or at least there's certainly a lot of discussion about it. The financial services industry consolidation certainly brings its own risks associated with the combination of retail banks and investment banks and insurance companies and all this kind of thing. Obviously those things are really great from the point of view of being able to offer one-stop shops, which you know I could easily argue is a great thing. On the other hand, every time you bring a different kind of financial institution together with another one, you're creating another potential conflict of interest. And so those are the kinds of things that we have to monitor. Shifting profit pools. Used to be that trading was really popular. Why was trading so popular? Because trading was really profitable. Well, we abolished fixed brokerage commissions back in the early 70s. That started to cause retail investors and their advisors to trade less because it was getting less profitable. Or at least, I guess they were actually trading more because it wasn't as expensive, but overall profit pools went down in that area. And you know, the same is true for lots of areas in the bank. Essentially what you've seen in investment banks, for instance, is as a result of a lot of the reforms that have happened in securities markets, pure trading activity isn't as profitable anymore. So they're shifting money into hedge funds, in proprietary trading, other kinds of vehicles like that, which is fine if that's the way the economics are driving it, but it changes the way that we want to think about some of these activities, because obviously the more profit pressure there is, the more potential there is that someone could be basically trying to, you know, do things to goose profits inappropriately. Globalization, technological advances almost go without saying, but those are things that we think about too in terms of trying to make sure that we are keeping pace with the shape of the industry that we are participating in. So given all that, what are we trying to do? Well, our strategic plan is based on this mission, which is pretty straightforward. Protect investors, maintain fair, orderly, and efficient markets, and facilitate capital formation. Those are three equally important legs of the mission in order to make sure that the full value system or the full value chain associated with securities transactions is really operating at the full level of efficiency and appropriateness that it should be. That gets divided into the various aspects of our strategic plan, which are, first of all, about enforcement and making sure that people are doing the right thing. Second of all, making sure that we're passing the kinds of regulations that are encouraging the right kinds of competition and making sure that people are behaving correctly. Encouraging and promoting informed investment decision making, which is really around our disclosure program, as well as making sure that investors have an opportunity at least to learn as much as they need to about a transaction before they enter into it. And then finally, seems a little bit like government speak to me actually, but maximizing the use of SEC resources basically means let's make sure the SEC itself is running as an efficient and effective organization. So, what are some of the kinds of things that we're really focused on these days in each one of these areas? In enforcement and examination, we spend a lot of time, as I mentioned, thinking about risk assessment and making sure that we're actually, for those of you who've seen the movie Minority Report, preventing crime before it happens. And in assisting with that, we actually spend a lot of time basically pre-enforcement in the examination area and other things. So, for instance, most financial institutions today have internal compliance officials. Our goal is to really work with these people very closely and ideally to create something that we call a doctor-patient relationship. So rather than us showing up at the doorstep and having everybody hide everything from us, we'd love to be in a position where the chief compliance officer is actually coming to us and said, let me talk about my compliance program. Let me explain to me where I think we're being really successful in terms of mitigating risk and where I think we may have some problems, because I'd really like some advice from the SEC on this. Now, for those of you who've worked in financial institutions, that may seem really, really strange that anyone would ever treat the SEC that way. That's where we're trying to go, because it really is important that we have folks inside these institutions that really are truly keeping compliance issues as their primary responsibility, in the same way that an audit committee is treating financial integrity as its primary responsibility, rather than worrying about EPS, which is essentially the function of that responsibility within a company. Chief compliance officer should be the same sort of way. Risk-based examination review is essentially about making sure that we're spending our resources examining the companies that are raising flags, as opposed to simply visiting them once every X years, depending on no matter what your size, no matter what your risk profile. Records management requirements is another issue that falls in here, making sure that we actually have the records that we as well as the compliance officers can actually go back and check. To establish the right kinds of audit trails and make sure that people are behaving correctly. We'll probably hear more about that one from the SEC. And then finally, once we get into the pursuit of abuses and the enforcement program, we're certainly trying to be appropriately aggressive in those areas as well. I'd just like to highlight the one aspect of this, which is up here, is called standard industry practice. What that is essentially talking about is the fact that in the financial services industry, there are a lot of relationships that are cozy and considered appropriate because they've been in place for a very long time. An example of this would be the relationship between research analysts and stock underwriters. That one blew up about 3 years ago, and at the time everyone was kind of like, well, that's what analysts do, isn't it? Isn't that their point? IPO allocations to friends and family ahead of retail investors. Well, that's the way business is done, isn't it? I mean, we're giving it's like giving people free tickets to sports events. Well, maybe not, because it's actually hurting someone too. And so we're actually spending a lot of our time questioning standard industry practices and really trying to figure out where remedies need to be put in place or guidelines to be put in place, if you want to be less harsh about it, to try to make sure the standard industry practice doesn't give a blank check to create compliance issues, to create conflicts of interest. Within the regulatory environment, there's a lot of stuff going on. Sarbanes-Oxley implementation is obviously one of those areas, and we can spend a little bit of time talking about that later, I suspect. Section 404 is basically hitting home this year, so we'll see how that goes. We're also in the middle of just kicking off a series of roundtables at the SEC to really get more feedback from the industry about how that's going, whether people are seeing benefits, what kinds of costs people are incurring in terms of implementing the thing, and trying to figure out whether or not there are certain aspects of the rules that we might need to tweak. For instance, for small businesses, that's something that's come up in the press often. Do you really want the same flavor of rules in place for those companies as well as larger ones? Maybe, maybe not, but that's something that we're going to be investigating. Associated with Sarbanes-Oxley, there's also a lot of new responsibilities for overseeing the accounting profession, make sure the auditing firms are actually doing the right thing. And there are also some requirements on ourselves in terms of making sure that we're reviewing companies in a more frequent and systematic sort of way. Mutual fund governance, for those of you who have spent some time at Fidelity or any of our other friends in the local area may know a little bit about that and some of the things that we've done there in terms of requiring independent directors on mutual fund boards and things like that. Hedge fund registration is something that is just now getting started. And then there's some other things that we're doing that are a little bit more technical in nature in terms of changing the way some of the exchanges operate in terms of price discovery mechanisms and things like that. As well as in the back office where we're actually issuing guidelines to the industry and making sure that they're doing the right kinds of business continuity planning. So that in the case of a major disaster, you're not going to have complete chaos, and there's a decent chance that the market can get back up in a reasonable amount of time. Informed investment. There are some things we've been doing in corporate disclosure to try to make sure that the information that's disclosed is useful and timely. We can talk more about that if we need to, but some of the items we're working on are making sure that if something happens in a company and it's material, that you disclose it. That the accounting treatments that are applied to various issues are the right ones according, and essentially we tend to take FASB's lead on things like this. So if you want to talk about stock options, if you want to talk about pension fund accounting, these are obviously big issues. Any kinds of intangibles accounting is a big deal these days. But that's largely in the domain of the accounting boards themselves. The chairman has been starting to say a few words publicly about executive compensation and about how more disclosure might be appropriate there. A similar set of issues on mutual funds, which is really about trying to make sure that the retail investor really understands, okay, so what is the fee? What is the fee profile here? What's the expense profile here? What is a 12B1 fee? These are all good questions. And some other types of issues that are associated with making sure that companies are going to the market with the right kinds of materials in the right kinds of ways. Finally, internally, I mean, one of the interesting things I think that really drew me to the SEC is the fact that for the first time, I believe in the SEC's history, we are really trying to implement changes to the organization to make it feel more like a commercial organization rather than a government agency. Historically speaking, the SEC has run something like the world's biggest law firm. Very smart people, very professional people, very committed people with a sense of public responsibility that I never would have imagined, but not necessarily a dynamic, professionally managed organization at all times. So, Chairman Donaldson was the CEO of Aetna. He was the head of the New York Stock Exchange. He founded Yale Business School. He's deeply steeped in what the state of the art of management in America is all about, and what he's really been trying to put in place is that kind of thing within the context of a public agency. So, we've been doing a lot in terms of HR management, a lot in terms of finance and other aspects of performance management, so that we can actually keep score. I don't think I fully appreciated the intellectual challenges as well as the operational challenges associated with trying to keep score when you don't have a P&L statement to go by. But those are some of the challenges that we face. And then finally, and we'll spend a little bit more time talking about this, is IT and making sure that the agency is leveraging technology internally as well as it can. So let's spend a little bit of time talking about that one in more detail. As I said, I've been around here for about a year, and we've been putting in some changes over the course of the past few years that I think have been starting to accelerate in the past year that I think are pretty exciting. I'll let you guys be the judge of that. Historically, though, the SEC has not been the most aggressive user of technology. Again, back to the law firm idea. Law firms really don't invest in technology unless it's something that they can really kind of, generate billable hours out of. So, why would you make yourself more efficient? I don't want to rag on lawyers. I almost went to law school myself, but I mean, there's a little bit of that kind of mentality in it. And so, Edgar is something where we've been very proud of for years. It's in some ways best practice in terms of what you might call government e-commerce. On the other hand, if you compare it to Amazon or eBay or Yahoo or some other information repositories like that, I think there's room for improvement. A few other important systems internally, but primarily you're dealing with an environment that is about Edgar and it's about PCs. And people don't even know how to use the PCs all that well. I sometimes joke, even if we could get people to use Excel effectively, you know, we'd be miles ahead of where we are now. But, you know, these things will take time. Where are we trying to go? Well, one of the most important things, we really want to embed technology into the business processes at the SEC. Remember all those things, those chevrons that I threw across the page there? Those are the processes that we need to automate because, you know, regardless of whether you're a, you know, a very you know, intellectually motivated legal professional whose work can't be measured in terms of widgets, there is still a need to be able to manage workflow, manage work product, and manage the agency as a whole in terms of what it needs to be doing. And one of the best ways to do that is going to be through technology. At the same time, we also have an external focus, and we want to make the information, whether disclosed through Edgar or elsewhere, much more useful and much more accessible and much more analyzable for investors, whether you're a retail investor or an institutional investor. And then underneath that, what we're really trying to do is build up an infrastructure that is secure and robust and flexible and efficient so that we can run all the rest of this cool stuff on top of it. And then, you know, overall, I mean, what I really try to stress internally is the idea that technology really needs to be part of our competitive advantage, which is a term that you don't hear in government very often, obviously, but if you think about us as really needing to complement the kinds of skills and sophistication and aggressiveness that you see in the securities industry, which in the U.S. is, I mean, the U.S. securities industry is perhaps the most dynamic industry in the world. And as their regulator, if we aren't able to be as innovative, as clever, as well informed, then we run the risk of falling behind the times, which means one of two things, right? Either we overregulate or underregulate, and either one of those would be bad. So, what does that actually translate into concretely? First thing is a series of things that we're trying to do in terms of improving specific processes and programs within the SEC. Electronic discovery and examination is essentially about taking our enforcement attorneys and our examination staff and allowing them to process a lot more information, a lot more documentation. If you think about what happens when we subpoena someone like Enron or another big company like that, literally truckloads of evidence boxes pull up at our loading dock. And then some poor lawyer has to go through and read them all. And that can take literally years. So what we're trying to do there is compress that process so that it can take days or weeks. Essentially by imaging that material, providing search tools over the top of it, and other forms of analysis tools that can allow lawyers to tease out the information much more quickly. Ditto for the kinds of folks who would be showing up in financial institutions and sifting through records there. Process automation, workflow, and content management. These are the kinds of things that are really about, it's really about managing paper-based work processes. If you think about the number of steps involved in an enforcement case, from inception through settlement or through judgment, there's a lot of paper flow, a lot of documents that go back and forth between people, a lot of things that need to be approved and signed and all this kind of stuff. And what we really want is build something that allows us to efficiently manage those systems, or to manage those processes. Electronic disclosure is essentially mostly about Edgar and trying to make sure that that information is as useful and accessible as possible. And finally, underneath all of this, we need to have a good set of data warehousing and analytics tools so that we can actually make more sense of all the information that we collect today. If you think about all the stuff that happens in the securities market, all the trading, all of the portfolios, all of the potential relationships between directors and officers and insiders and all this kind of stuff, there's an enormous wealth of information out there that could be very useful, we believe, in terms of risk assessment and in terms of being able to really interpret much faster what's going on in a particular market. And so we want to get more transparency by building some tools to do this kind of thing. And we're quite behind state of the art in that area. I won't spend as much time on the other columns, but in terms of improving the agency-wide technical environment, we are certainly trying to make users more productive. My Excel joke was not a joke. We're also laying in some better technical infrastructure to make sure that we're managing our storage correctly. We're expanding our network capabilities and putting in a lot of just basic things like that to try to make sure that we really have the capacity that we need in order to manage these much more advanced IT functions that we're trying to put in place. And finally, just like everyone else, we're concerned about disaster recovery and business continuity and making sure that we can stay in business because we do have a role to play in making sure that the markets continue to function correctly. Finally, underneath all of that, there's kind of the CIO stuff, which is really about making sure that IT is managed well, making sure that we're building things in a secure sort of way, that we're managing information privacy, which is a big issue in government these days, that we're creating the right kinds of business cases to manage our investment flow and making sure that we're tracking our projects and managing them well. And finally, to make sure that we're attracting the right kinds of talent and managing the right kinds of talent within the IT organization. Obviously, that stuff is extremely internally focused, but it's a big part of my job, certainly. So, moving on from that, I thought I'd spend just a little bit of time drilling down into two big initiatives that we're working on. First, discovery and case management, and then secondly, we can talk a little bit about what's going on with Edgar. If you think about discovery and case management, as I said, it's an enormous amount of stuff that comes in the door. And the stuff is getting even bigger all the time. As we start getting into the thing where we are getting email files from people, well, if you think about the amount of stuff you guys store in email files, I mean, it's pretty amazing, and it's exponentially greater than the amount of stuff that you probably store in paper. So there's all that stuff to manage. Sometimes, in certain cases, we may actually go out and seize hard drives and things like that for people, which means, well, there's another 80 gigabytes worth of stuff that we've got to search through. So we want to create a thing that allows us to really manage all of that, and then to do the second bullet, which is to manage those cases and exams from cradle to grave, and really doing so in a way that allows us to actually manage the thing as a business process, as opposed to kind of a professional exercise, because we have a lot of these things, and we need to manage them in a very operational sort of way. So with my apologies, I'm going to just get a little bit more technical and go into a diagram of what it is that we're trying to build, but I don't think it's going to be scary for anybody. First of all, like I said, big stores of evidentiary documents. We're talking, I was surprised that you used the word exabyte without having people kind of groan, but it's not that big, but we are talking about terabytes worth of stuff, certainly. On top of that, well, how are you going to get to it? Well, you need to have search and analysis tools. This is Google and beyond in terms of being able to do free text search. We also want to be able to do interesting things like examine interrelationships between people based on email traffic and things like that. On top of that, of course, the lawyer is going to sift through his or her evidence and then build a case on top of it. So what do you need? Well, you need a case management system. And if you think about all the steps in that, from inquiry to investigation, to litigation, to penalties, which actually involves not just getting the person to cut the check to you, but also distributing them back to the people who were hurt. That's one of our big missions. We're talking about a lot of complexity there. And so what we really want to build is a system that allows us to really manage that workflow across, at any given time, we may have 1,000, 1,200, 1,500 cases active. Underneath that, of course, are the working papers that are associated with those cases. Where are the briefs stored? Where are the judgments stored? Where are the subpoenas stored? All those kinds of things should be managed within the context of this workflow. And then finally, you know, my colleague, Steve Cutler, who manages the enforcement division, would probably like to know what's going on with all those cases. Well, that's management reporting, and making sure that the guy can actually track the portfolio of all these cases and make sure that he knows which ones are high priority, which ones are moving at what speed, and where he needs to apply his attention, as well as the attention of the other commissioners or anyone else. So that's basically what we're trying to build there, and that's going to be a very interesting challenge for us, because today our tools are not nearly as good as they should be. Finally, disclosure in Edgar. I thought I'd spend a little bit of time talking about some of our aspirations there, because in my opinion, any changes that we can make here would just be enormously publicly useful, and that's really, and that would be a very exciting thing to be able to do. So, first of all, a little bit of a vignette about Edgar. 600,000 documents. There are, I forget the number in terms of the thousands of registrants and things like that, but there are a lot. It also includes all filings of individuals, directors, officers, and insiders, and their stock holdings. So, you know, there's a lot of stuff in there. 100 different forms, 300 subtypes within those forms. Just as a little exercise here, how many people know what a 10K is? Raise your hands. Okay, that's good. 14A. Oh, we got one. What is it? Close. That's a 5. 14A is a proxy statement. That's where you get the juicy details on executive comp and things like that. NSAR, anyone know that one? Any Fidelity folks? No, that's a mutual fund semi-annual report. All kinds of great information about mutual funds and the way that they're structured and what they hold and all that kind of stuff. Practically inaccessible given the current way in which we collect that data. Last one, F7POS. Any ideas on that one? If anyone knew that one, I would be shocked because it turns out there were 0 of these filed in the last year. It's a post-effective amendment to a registration statement for securities of certain Canadian issuers offered for cash upon the exercise of rights granted to existing security holders under the Securities Act of 1933. So, you know, great, that's wonderful. I'm very glad that we have that form. But you know, we have some work to do in terms of cleaning this thing up and trying to create information that's really useful, not just to the lawyers who have to make sure that the stuff is compliant, but also making sure that it's useful for investors. So, you know, there's some of that kind of stuff. Finally, you know, the point about format. Text and HTML format is great in terms of just getting the data out there, but it's not so great in terms of analysis. So if you really want to analyze the stuff, you got to print it out, you got to type it into Excel, you got to run some ratios and all this kind of stuff. So what we really want to do is first of all move to tag data formats. XML, XBRL, things like that. We can talk a little bit more about that if you guys want, but essentially what it's about is creating that data as analytically useful. So you can say, I want to know EMC's revenue in 2003, and ask Edgar that question explicitly, and it'll pop out. Finally, in bigger picture, we'd like to rethink some of these disclosure requirements. What do investors actually need to know, and what's the best way to present it to them so that they can make the most informed investment decisions? And that's a really you know, big and fundamental issue that's going to take a lot of work to try to think about how we can consolidate these forms, how we can make sure the information collected is collected in the most useful way possible. So finally, let me spend a few minutes talking about potential implications. I should also preface all of this by saying that I'm always supposed to say a disclaimer at some point during the speech. These are my opinions. These don't reflect the opinions of the Commission or the Commissioners or other members of the staff. And so, you know, just take it as that. First of all, corporate issuers. This is a lot of, I think, what people will probably end up talking about elsewhere in this session with Sarbanes-Oxley, some of the other rules that we put in place, and what does all that mean in terms of just a simple company who happens to be public or happens to want to issue stock or debt or something like that. Well, first of all, I think it's important to recognize that governance is going to continue to be important. And you know, yes, there may be periods of time where we go back to the gold rush and everybody forgets about it, but some of these rules are going to be here to stay, and it's going to continue to evolve over time. So I think the idea that there is a responsibility here, a fiduciary responsibility, is going to continue to be an important one. Winners and losers may well emerge in the market. I'd be interested to know whether the faculty has any impressions about that, but you know, I would like to think anyway that companies that do visibly better in compliance issues than companies that do not disclose as well, do not audit themselves as well, that the capital markets are actually going to pick up on that and change the share prices as a result. I would also hope, and this is particularly in light of Sarbanes-Oxley and things like that, forward-thinking companies would actually think about this as an opportunity and not just a hassle. A lot of the problems associated with certifying and testing of financial statements have to do with the fact that the financial processes are so complex today. You've got 19 different people looking at these numbers before they become final. If you could implement some kind of straight-through processing, some kind of better set of systems and processes to deal with all that kind of stuff, a lot of the problems go away, and you'd probably be taking out costs as well. And I would like to think that companies are going to be realizing those benefits down the road here. Market intermediaries. So these are exchanges and broker-dealers and mutual funds and things like that. A lot of things that we're trying to do there, which I've already mentioned most of. Similarly, compliance is going to be important for these folks, and it always has been, and it's going to continue to be more so. At the end of the day, the securities industry needs to have compliance built into it in order for it to be a level playing field. Otherwise, you're back to the era of robber barons in a real big hurry. I'd also like to think that people who do a good job with their chief compliance officers and things like that are going to end up being able to police themselves, resulting in less aggressive action from outside, whether us or Elliott Spitzer or other states or anyone else. And you know, just fundamentally, I think it's worthwhile examining some of these business models and thinking about whether or not there are inherent conflicts of interest built into the standard industry practices. and whether or not there are market inefficiencies that we may end up kind of relaxing some of the regulations to eliminate some of those over time. People who do well in this business are going to be the people that really add value, not the people that benefit from different aspects of not level playing fields. Finally, in terms of implication for investors, and these are perhaps the highest level points to be made, and hopefully the reason that we're doing all of this stuff. First of all, I think it's important to recognize that investing is always going to be risky, unless you're holding T-bills to maturity. That's just the nature of the beast. And so what we're really trying to do is try to create an environment where investors can make thoughtful, informed decisions to the extent their appetite makes them interested in doing so. In order to do so, we certainly want to provide better information and more intelligently presented information so that people really know what they're trying to do and what the pros and cons are. And we want to create that in such a way that people are really aware of the structure of the markets to some extent too. So people really understand when my stockbroker is giving me advice, do I take that advice at face value, or do I consider the fact that he or she may be compensated based on commissions or something like that? These are things that, interestingly enough, not all investors know. Finally, the ultimate goal of this is to try to make sure that investors feel like this is a level playing field and that they have as much a right to anyone as to make a profit in this industry and make sure that they're accomplishing whatever financial plans they happen to have. So that's really what it's all about. And I think that as you've seen, what we're really trying to do is create a combination of policy initiatives and internal operational initiatives and technology initiatives to try to make that happen. So that's all I have as part of this presentation, but I look forward to talking more during the Q&A. Thank you.